Well, thank you, Ron. And thank you to Cyber Florida, U.S. Central Command, U.S. Special Operations Command, and the National Defense University for the opportunity to join you today. You put together an amazing schedule and an agenda, and just appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to some of the greatest Americans around, including this morning with General McMaster. Before introducing General McMaster and before kicking off the conversation, I just thought it would be appropriate and important to take a minute to recognize the sacrifice so many Americans have made, both on the day of 9/11 itself and obviously up to today, 20 years later. Whether our first responders or whether our women and men in uniform, so many have made the ultimate sacrifice. And while those may have been the most horrific day of our generation, it also brought out some of the best of America. And esprit de corps, I had the privilege of working for President Bush immediately after 9/11, and I can tell you there was no red or blue in the United States. It was all red, white, and blue. And some of the very best took the call to action, took it seriously, and provided all they could to secure America. Topping that list is General McMaster, our guest today, who needs no introduction. You all have his biography. If I were to actually list off all his command and leadership posts and all of his decorations, that would take up the entire 45 minutes to an hour. So I'll try to be very brief in introducing General McMaster. As many of you know, he had spent 34 years in uniform, noted for his battlefield prowess, but also known as a scholar soldier. While serving in the U.S. Army, he pursued his PhD at UNC, Tar Heel. I won't get into a War Eagle set of issues right here, but bottom line is he has always brought a lot of intellectual heft and thought leadership that is very rare to combine theory and practice, and has done so in so many great ways for so many years. He retired after 34 years. He's a graduate of West Point, class of '84, and retired as National Security Advisor as Lieutenant General in the U.S. Army. General McMaster, absolute privilege to have you join us today. Thank you for taking the time. And before we jump into the meat of the discussion, and day one was very much focused on day of 9/11. Day two, I think it's an opportunity to look at some of the lessons learned, and dare I say, maybe some lessons we haven't learned. But I would like to start with, just to set the stage, where you were on 9/11 itself, what that day meant to you, and sort of your trajectory in terms of moving forward. So, sir, thank you.
Hey, Frank, it's great to see you again. And what a privilege it is to be with those who have committed to serve our nation, our servicemen and women and our civilians who are dedicated to protecting our nation, preserving peace, and building a better future, securing a better future for generations of Americans to come. I was so proud to serve alongside of you, and now as a washed-up general, you have my admiration and deepest thanks. I'll tell you, 20 years ago, it's hard to believe it's 20 years ago, but I had the privilege of commanding the 1st Squadron, 4th United States Cavalry, prepared and loyal, and was in Schweinfurt, Germany, in the middle, in a short break between two rotations to the Combined Arms Training Center at Hohenfels, Germany, and we had just completed a heavy light rotation with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, which was it was a great time. We had this kind of nutty brigade commander who we all know, but many of us know, Colonel Yarbrough, who was a hoot. And then so my West Point classmates, were involved in that rotation. Really, Mike Kershaw, what a great leader, and Bill Rapp and so forth. A lot of really great guys. Mike Miklos, and your own SOCOM commander was there as well. And I'll tell you, we had a great rotation. I think that both units were at a very high level of training, and I think that over the years, General Clark and I looked back on that really fondly. All of us had, because we really worked out a lot of great tactics, techniques, and procedures for heavy light operations, and we came out of it on a high. And then of course we all got that punch to the gut on September 11th. Of course, like everybody, he was kind of just shocked. What the hell happened here? And then, of course, it really just made it, I think, even more urgent for us to prepare for deployment or whatever we're called on to do. And of course, all of us soldiers, all of us American warriors, we wanted to be the first to go. Right now, we didn't deploy from Germany, but many of our soldiers, obviously, the vast majority of our soldiers, deployed with various units to either Afghanistan or Iraq in the ensuing years. And so we were determined to build the highest level of combat readiness and to be prepared to avenge the most devastating terrorist attack in history, the mass murder of nearly 3,000 innocents, and we were anxious to do our duty.
Well, thank you, sir. And I might note there's just one general I need to recognize because I had the privilege to work alongside him in the White House, and that's General Downing, who I miss every day, affectionately known as Wad. So it does bring back a lot of very tough, but also very rewarding memories. And I want to jump to the geopolitical implications we're dealing with today. 20 years ago, we went into Afghanistan in large part because the country was providing safe haven to Osama bin Laden, to Al Qaeda, and to so many others, the Haqqani network and others that have popped up. Last few days, the exit, not necessarily the finest day for our country, but I'd be curious. That's my opinion. I'd be curious what your thoughts are in terms of how going forward these implications will pose for the United States, and very specifically your assessment on the terrorist threat that Afghanistan under Taliban rule may pose, not only the Taliban itself, but also rule in the country. So you've been very thoughtful and outspoken on some of these issues. I'd be curious what your thoughts are.
Well, it's devastating. I think, Frank, we have to recognize we lost a war, and we lost a war mainly through self-defeat. I mean, I think of this as essentially a surrender to a terrorist organization. And this goes back to the capitulation negotiations and the capitulation agreement of February of 2020, in which our Secretary of State flew to Doha, Qatar, sat across some of the most odious people on earth who actually are a veneer, right? They're a front for a brutal and murderous terrorist organization that is utterly intertwined with those who committed the mass murder attacks of 9/11. And the reason the way that we were able to rationalize this surrender to a terrorist organization is through self-delusion. Self-delusion really based on the idea, that wars end when one side disengages, not recognizing the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that this particular enemy has. It was self-delusion based on, instead of fighting the actual enemy in Afghanistan, over many years, by the way, we conjured up the enemy we would prefer. Oh, well, the Taliban, that's just kind of this rural movement. And, they deserve a say, right, in a future government, not acknowledging the fact that they were the beneficiaries of tremendous international support from jihadist terrorists, Al Qaeda, foremost among those groups, Pakistan's ISI, Gulf states that funded the Taliban through Pakistan's ISI. And to see that we didn't see the Taliban as we should have, as utterly interconnected with the Haqqani network, one of the most dangerous and brutal, unscrupulous terrorist organizations in the world. And all of this, of course, exists in an ecosystem in which we have over 20 U.S. designated terrorist organizations that sit kind of astride Afghanistan and Pakistan. It was based on the self-delusion as well that the Taliban would share power, right? Now, how's that working out, right? We actually put together kind of a conspiracy, like a cabal, to undercut the existing government of Afghanistan and to replace it, with some kind of a triumvirate, maybe of Hamid Karzai, who I think has kind of lost his mind, Abdullah, and then Mullah Baradar. I don't know, Hibatullah Akhundzada, right? I mean, so I think that we deluded ourselves to the extent that we actually partnered with the Taliban against the Afghan government. This is the most extraordinary example of self-defeat I think that I'm maybe aware of in history. And so what we got, I think, should have been no surprise. When you surrender to terrorists, you get what we see today. And not only did we prioritize withdrawal over the achievement of a worthy aim, an aim worthy of the sacrifices that have been made across 20 years, but we actually weakened the Afghan government and security forces and strengthened the Taliban on our way out. We strengthened the Taliban by giving them a timeline, by telling them, sure, yeah, you can have veto power over how many troops we have, and we'll agree to the troop caps to placate you as we make concession after concession. Oh yeah, sure, we'll force the Afghan government to release 5,000 of some of the most heinous people on earth, who, as you know, immediately went back to terrorizing the Afghan people and commanding Taliban and Al Qaeda forces in the field. And then we'll just let everybody know, hey, we're done on a certain date, May 1st, under the Trump administration, extended, till September 1st, August 31st under the Biden administration. And what that equated to was a series of psychological blows to the Afghan government and the Afghan security forces. And we know from talking to Afghans, I'm sure this crowd knows better than anybody, what the Taliban did is they took that. Hey, they took our capitulation agreement and they went around to the Afghans and said, hey, here are your alternatives. When we give you the wink, you accommodate with us, or we kill your families. How does that sound? Right. So the rapid collapse to me did not come as a surprise at all, because we set it up. And I think that we should not only be ashamed of ourselves, but now we have to really focus on, not continuing the self-delusion. And so I think maybe an important theme of this conference ought to be, hey, let's just stop pretending, right? Let's stop pretending that we can partner with the Taliban on security. I can't believe I've heard senior military officers say that. I can't believe it. Let's stop pretending that this isn't a victory for Al Qaeda and other jihadist terrorist organizations. Let's stop pretending that we just need to engage the Afghans the Taliban on the future of Afghanistan. How about engaging non-Taliban Afghans instead? And I think we have to stop pretending really in the immediate future that we haven't just created a hostage crisis that is far worse than Tehran in 1979 by leaving behind, I think, are hundreds of American citizens, visa holders, and of course, tens of thousands of those, more than that, who have assisted us and now are going to be subjected to the utter brutality of the Taliban. So I guess if there's, sorry to go on so long, but how about just stop pretending? I think that what I have seen across the last several months, again going back to the February 22, 2020 agreement, is an astounding degree of self-delusion. And then also, I think maybe I think unlimited, hypocrisy. I mean, to announce not extending the deadline on August 31st, and then to say, human rights are really foundational to our foreign policy. To say America's back, allies, America's back, and then we leave their citizens, our European allied citizens, in the lurch in Afghanistan. What's extraordinary to me is the loss of credibility. So we are in a crisis that is political. We're in a crisis that is a security crisis because of the degree to which jihadist terrorists have been emboldened and now will control the safe haven and support base that we know makes them orders of magnitude more effective. Hey, we know that from 9/11, right? It's not a theoretical case. We also know that from ISIS in Iraq. And I think we also have a crisis of competence in our government, in our military. Our elites have failed us in a profound way. And so I think that the only way we can salvage anything out of this moment is to be brutally honest about it.
Well, that's a very sobering assessment. And I might note, you have always spoken truth to power, and as you perceived it, even in uniform. You wrote a book on dereliction of duty, looking back in history. So this is not just the General McMaster out of office. This has been your keen insights all throughout. So I think that's important to recognize and note, and incredibly sobering. I want to build on one of the last points you made, and that's sort of looking at some of our allies. And what do you think the implications are in terms of having the trust and confidence of our allies? Let's start maybe with Five Eyes, then go to NATO and what that could mean more broadly. And then how does that affect and impact our ability to lead on the global stage?
Well, it's had a profound negative impact. This withdrawal without really helping our allies or extending the timeline, all the things we could have done. If we had lifted. I understand the dilemma that our senior leaders were in once they're told by the commander in chief that, hey, here's the date you're leaving by, and here's how many soldiers you have. Okay, like what are your options, right? You don't have options after that decision's made. And I hope, and I can't imagine that that our combatant commanders and our chairman and others didn't give their best advice and say this is really bad, right? So of course it's the commanders in chief's prerogative, right? I mean, it's nobody elects generals to make policy decisions, right? So we have to give our best advice, but not cross the line between advice and advocacy. But I think this is one of maybe the risks associated with this, the costs associated with this decision that may not have been fully considered. Our allies are looking for other partners like themselves, across Europe. Who else can they work with? And of course, there is nobody else except the United States. But they have profound doubts about us because they've concluded that we lack the will. Right? We lack competence, which I've talked about and I read about extensively in this last book. But they also now doubt our will to sustain an effort, and they also they also think that we may not be a reliable partner anymore, and they see it across multiple administrations. I'm not making this as a partisan criticism, but one of the things I think is worth pointing out is how outraged everybody was during the Trump administration when President Trump would tweet rudely about our allies. Actually, I think what we've just done is actually much more consequential than a rude tweet.
True, and well said. So one of the key issues is obviously if you provide the time and space to plot and execute attacks. So Al Qaeda is a safe haven, as a base of operations. It's not only the direct implications regionally or in country, but also to the homeland. And we kind of lose the ability to influence and have our adversaries at least looking over their shoulder instead of plotting and executing attacks in terms of what that means. And obviously, since the end of the Cold War, threat forecasting has made astrology look respectable. But I'd like to get sort of your thoughts on whether or not you see the implications raised in terms of threats directly to the U.S. homeland, as well as our interests overseas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really think that anybody who thinks otherwise is, again, still engaging in self-delusion or pretending, something different. So, we know that these groups become much more potent when they gain control of territory, populations, and resources. As I mentioned, we saw it again in Iraq. Many of you in this conference lived it, right? Because, it was after the disengagement from Iraq in December 2011. And again, attending that as well, a large release of terrorists from prison that allowed Al Qaeda in Iraq to strengthen and then morph into ISIS, which became, as we know, the most devastating terrorist attack or terrorist organization in history, conducting, I think it was 195, right, external attacks during the period during which they controlled territory the size of Britain, immediately recruited 30,000 fighters. All of this is already happening, right, in Afghanistan. Just in the past week, right, jihadist terrorists are moving to what they know will now be a safe haven. You had, Al Qaeda declare again, bayat, or its loyalty to the Taliban in the celebratory message. You have senior leaders in Al Qaeda returning to Afghanistan. We just saw one of them drive up in his white SUV in Nangarhar province. And we've also seen the limitations associated with so-called over-the-horizon, counter-terrorist capabilities, because all of us know, right? All of us professionals who've been working on this know that you need human intelligence networks to augment your sensitive collection capabilities and surveillance capabilities. You also know that you need bases, right, so that you can employ assets, in sufficient scale and for sufficient duration to develop an intelligence picture deliberately. We can do those with global assets, as everybody knows, but without bases forward, that's extremely difficult to do, and it complicates signal intelligence as well. And then also we don't have the arm to do anything about it that we had in Afghanistan, which was the Afghans. And of course, it frustrates me. It frustrates all of us that the Afghan forces were not stronger than they were, more resilient than they were. But of course, we have to point out, right, that over 60,000 of them gave their lives preserving the freedoms they've enjoyed since 2001 and fighting the enemies of all civilization on a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. And so without that force, obviously, we're a lot less effective in one of these key terrorist ecosystems, and a place that is ideologically important to jihadist terrorists, much like Mesopotamia is as well, the Khorasan region. So I think that we're in for a rough time, and what we're going to come to regret, I think, is that we didn't continue to pay essentially the insurance premium of a sustained commitment in support of Afghan forces who are bearing the brunt of the counterterrorist fight. And there's no, as we saw, right, with the drone strike, and listen, I mean, mistakes like this happen in war, especially against a brutal enemy that's intermingling with civilian populations. But striking the civilian target in Kabul that was mistaken for a car bomb, hey, we know that's what happens when you don't have forces on the ground and you don't have, and your human intelligence network has been disrupted or broken as it has been in Afghanistan. And, I would just ask a question, about this idea that we were partnering with the Taliban for security of the Kabul airport. I think that this is really kind of unconscionable. Suraj Haqqani was the head of security in Kabul. And we all know, for those of us who've been tracking the enemy for years, and I think some people don't track the enemy close enough, like a lot of times, most people don't, that the Haqqanis were running the Kabul threat network, for the last, at least over a decade. And they're the masters of committing mass murder attacks against civilian targets in Kabul. Remember the mass murder attacks against the German embassy, really was the target of our embassy in 2017. The following attacks against funerals. Hey, that's what Suraj Haqqani does, right? And then we were surprised, right? We're surprised. Oh, and then I heard some of these other, my fellow washed up generals on CNN, saying, oh, well, this was just as big of a blow against the Taliban as it is us. I mean, really? Have we gotten to that degree of self-delusion? I mean, this was the perfect setup for them. They made us wholly dependent on them for security. They let an attack go through. I mean, is there anybody who doesn't think that some elements of ISIS overlap with the Haqqani network? And they got to humiliate us on the way out and inflict losses on our servicemen and women and on Afghans who were trying to get out of Afghanistan. So, the idea that we can rely on these people, that we can partner with them in security, and I wonder where do we get the intelligence on the car bomb? Was that deliberate? So anyway, there are people in this audience who will know much better than I do. But I just think this is, again, consistent with the theme, this idea of over the horizon. Hey, let's stop pretending about that too,
Yeah, and I know how hard it was to build trust with our allies to share intelligence and information when we have to deal with less than allied entities. That you're spot on. So you certainly don't want to be dependent upon that. I'd be curious, beyond the Afghan region itself, the past few weeks also emboldened other terrorist organizations, or maybe they don't. I personally feel they do. But you've seen a lot of momentum in Africa, both East and West Africa, both in terms of jihadist and Islamist movements. I'd be curious what your snapshot is there, and then very specifically, what the implications are for Special Operations Command. And this is my opinion. When I look back since 9/11, if I were to say there were one greatest breakthrough, and this may not be shared, and please shoot it down if you disagree, it's the synchronization of Title 10 and Title 50 authorities. When you look back to the immediacy after 9/11 to lash up our intelligence community with our women and men in uniform in the Title 10 role, culminated through JSOC. That was pretty damn impressive, and I'm worried that some of that capacity may be atrophied as well. So I'd be curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, Frank, I would say there were a number of just revolutions in terms of, our effectiveness. I just think what SOCOM did overall, what all of our special operations forces did to adapt, it's I think a pretty well-known story now. It is the melding together of intelligence capabilities with special operations forces and conventional capabilities. And it's the development of partner capabilities, not only, special operations, but also conventional force and law enforcement and intelligence, right? Such that, that we, with a relatively small amount of investment, can work through partners to ensure that these jihadist terrorist groups don't, again, really gain the strength, the power, the ability to conduct attacks against us on the scale of 9/11, right? So I think I think the biggest blow that is associated with the transnational or the transnational jihadist terrorist threat is really one of a psychological blow to our counter terrorism efforts, and a boon, right? A encouragement to our enemies, right? Everybody wants to join a winning team, and we saw this with ISIS, right? And how there's slick propaganda efforts and recruiting efforts. I mean, I think that's going to be the immediate effect, right? Is more and more jihadists congregating, gaining strength, and then also I think what you'll see is as they gain control of territory and populations and resources, then they're able to coerce adolescents into the cause. You see this happens in the federal administrative tribal areas. It happens across Africa, where really these groups engage in child abuse on an industrial scale through brainwashing and then systematic dehumanization. And so I think we are already, because of ISIS really, and the alumni of Al Qaeda, we already have a multi-generational problem on our hands. So for SOCOM, I mean, the main effect is like job security, I guess. I mean, I think that wars don't end when one side disengages, and we're going to learn that the hard way. And the demand for special operations forces will go up and up no matter how much we want to pivot to great power competition. We're not going to have the luxury to do that because our enemy is not going to allow us to do it. And so I think that what you'll see in the absence of a commitment to the kind of approach that we know works, right, which is sustained engagement abroad with partners who bear the brunt of the fight. If we pull back from that, SOCOM forces, special operations forces, will become a crutch. We'll become more and more of a tactical and operational crutch to compensate for our strategic bankruptcy, right? So what I would say is you're needed more than ever. As much as this self-inflicted defeat in Afghanistan stings all of us, what alternative do we have but to continue to get better every day, to pursue these enemies of all humanity more effectively and than ever, and to sustain our efforts. And so I would just say to all of you, we need all of you more than ever. And I think the other analogy I like to make, Frank, since I've been pretty hard hitting about this, is that if you think about my generation's experience, right? The old guys, like General Clark and me, right? We came into an army that was experiencing a renaissance, an army that had been, almost destroyed by the Vietnam War and the personnel policies associated with the Vietnam War, the divisiveness of it, the loss of that war, had been strained by racial division, had been affected by widespread drug use and lack of discipline, and a generation of officers who had been in the army, had been in the army prior to Vietnam. They said, "Hey, we're not going to stand for this." And with this new all volunteer force, they put in a series of policies and an emphasis on improved recruiting and improved discipline professional military education, a revolution in training, and certainly, the big five of procurement and modernization. But it was really these kind of soft changes that strengthened our professionalism of the force and gave us incredible combat power, right? And so I think we're not at that same point, right? I mean, our military is in much better shape than it was, I would say, in 1975. But I think this is a challenge for us. How do we absorb, this blow of self defeat in Afghanistan, and strengthen, our joint force, and strengthen our professional military ethic. I think that's the challenge for leaders, who are in this conference today.
General McMaster, I think that very powerful words and very true. And I'm glad you brought it back to people and leadership, because at the end of the day, technology changes. Even when we're talking cyber and space and everything else that's forward leaning, human nature remains pretty consistent. And as we've seen over history, it's in the application and the use of technology and the professionalization to be able to implement and achieve outcomes we're hoping to achieve. So thank you for not only discussing that, but putting a fine point on that, because that often does get lost in the discussion. I do want to get into the backdrop of, you can't look at Afghanistan in isolation of the greater power conflict and that context. But before I do that, and this may seem like a trite question, and maybe it's because I'm getting old, but I feel like we've lost the fundamentals of strategic analysis. And maybe it's not analysis, maybe it's a policy set of issues. So maybe
it's competence. It's competence, Frank. We are strategically incompetent, right, as a nation. And the reason for that is we don't apply design thinking to the challenges we're facing in the wars that we're fighting. We don't try to understand, these challenges and these problem sets and our enemies on their own terms. We don't consider what is driving conflict and the very nature of the conflict with which we're engaged. So we step into the trap that Clausewitz told us we need to avoid, right? The first right and duty of the statesman, stateswoman, is not to try to turn war into something alien to its nature. That's what we've done. And we've done it in a number of ways, right? We forgot that war is an extension of politics. Okay, well, that's like the Geico commercial, right? Everybody knows that. Like Clausewitz said, war is an extension of politics. But what that means is, you can't just wage war and then take the George Costanza approach and leave on a high note, right? You have to be able to consolidate gains to get the sustainable political outcomes consistent with your interests. And in Afghanistan, that was an Afghan government and security forces that were hostile to jihadist terrorists, and that were strengthened enough to withstand the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, which was across the border, mainly in Pakistan. And to do that, you have to take that extraordinarily successful initial military campaign in 2001 and then take the actions necessary to consolidate those gains. Now, this isn't nation building. It's not turning Afghanistan into Denmark. It's turning Afghanistan back into freaking Afghanistan without the Taliban. And so this idea that you can just do a bunch of military stuff, right? Maybe drive an enemy regime out of power and then just leave, right? Doesn't acknowledge the political nature of war. Now, there are military operations that we will leave right away. And that's a raid, right? That a raid is it's a military operation of short duration, limited purpose, and planned withdrawal, right? That's an important tool for SOCOM and our joint force. But that's not waging war, right? And so the second aspect of our strategic competence that's lacking is that war is human and that people fight for the same reasons Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. I can't tell you how many times, right, in the past couple of months. Well, it's not really in the Taliban's, interest to not cooperate with us on security. I mean, really, are you kidding me? I mean, what more do you need to know other than that Hibatullah Akhundzada's son was a suicide bomber in 2017? Do you really think it's a cold calculation of interest that drives him? Or maybe it's a perverted interpretation of Islam and an ideology that drives him? So I think that, again, war is human and we don't consider it. And so we engage in this self-delusion, right? And mirror imaging, and we fall into all these cognitive traps of optimism bias and confirmation bias and groupthink, right? I mean, and then the third aspect of strategic competence and acknowledging continuities in nature of war is that war is uncertain. Hey, guess what? Well, we know this better than anybody, right? I mean, we should, as professional military officers, that the future course of events doesn't depend on what we decide to do, exclusively, maybe even primarily. It depends on our enemies, right? And what they decide to do. Think about how we waged the war in Afghanistan. In 2009, we reinforced the security effort and then gave the Taliban and everybody the timeline for our withdrawal, and then said, "Oh, yeah, we'd like to talk to you on our way out, and and work out a deal." How the hell does that work? How does that work, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the enemy did have a say in the future course of events. And then finally, war is a contest of wills, and you hear these days, people say, "Oh, well, the American people, they didn't support the war," and well, 3 presidents in a row told them it wasn't worth it, right? I mean, what do you think the American people are going to say? With the exception, I would say, of the August 2017 South Asia strategy. That's the only time we had a sensible, reasoned, policy in place. And of course, President Trump abandoned it, doubled down on the flaws of the Obama administration policy, and then President Biden doubled down on the capitulation agreement. So I really think that we are not serious people, because we lack basic competence. And there are a number of reasons for this. I think there are a lot of people in senior positions in government who've never led anything, right? I mean, they've never done anything except, maybe be in academic environments or write policy papers, But when you write a policy paper, you write a paper, this paper is not going to, I mean, what does that do? You can't hit the enemy over the head with it. They have no idea really about execution, implementation. And the other element of our strategic incompetence has to do with a failure to integrate all elements of national power and efforts of like-minded partners oriented on objectives and goals in war, right? An outcome. And I'll tell you, it's almost like we don't deserve to win wars, Frank. I mean, what is this phrase, responsible end? When did that come into vogue? I mean, I guess we just don't need to win wars anymore. I will tell you that not only is that counterproductive, because as Clausewitz said, in war, each side tries to outdo the other. And if you're just going for the responsible end, you're going to get your ass kicked, right? I mean, do you know any boxers who get in the ring and say, I don't really want to win. I just want a responsible end to this match. And what's sad about it is the stakes in war are much, much higher, obviously, because they involve life and death. So,
wow.
I think that then what we've done, instead of integrating elements of national power, we do the opposite. They cut against each other, right? What we were doing militarily in Afghanistan, we didn't even have the Taliban as a designated enemy anymore when I became National Security Advisor. I couldn't believe it. Then I had to struggle to get the Department of Defense to do what the president told him, which is redesignate the Taliban as an enemy. The Department of Defense, I'm telling you, was a more difficult partner for me, than any other department. It's also that people did not want to ramp up the war and take the fight to the enemy. And the reason, I wanted to close the Taliban Political Commission because there was a joke, right? These people are living in 5-star hotels and raising money, while the military arm of the Taliban is blowing up girls' schools. They're sending their kids to private girls' schools, while the military arm of the Taliban is blowing up girls' schools in Afghanistan. And of course, it doesn't mean that you're not going to negotiate at some point, but you have to negotiate from a position of strength. That's not new, right? But it's like we forgot it. George Shultz once said that negotiation is a euphemism for capitulation unless the shadow of power is cast across the bargaining table. It's like we forgot that, right? So, I think, we talk about, we're going to develop strategists in our army and everything else, and I mean, we might be doing a great job at it, but I'm telling you, at the national level, there's a heck of a lot more work to do. And I think a lot of this has to do with, so-called security studies programs that teach like international relations theories, that then the graduates try to have fit situations into. And what they do is they give only a veneer of understanding, and they lay a sort of a deceptive rationale for folly and failure.
Wow, powerful words, and I think the concept around design thinking is really important here. And a hat tip to Stanford, probably the top D school or design school globally. That some of that thinking, in addition to the TTPs we all understand, and some of the national security thinking, does need to be brought to bear. But at the end of the day, it is about leadership. And I think you said that as powerfully as one can say. And I like to say we have tactics masquerading as strategy. I think what you're saying is much more powerful and disconcerting kind of going forward. But I do want to jump quickly to the context of greater power competition. Seems to be a whole lot of gloating coming out of Beijing, Moscow, and probably Tehran and Pyongyang and elsewhere. But let's focus on Moscow and China. I mean Moscow, Russia and China for a moment. What is this? I mean, does this mean we can actually make the pivot to Asia, or does this actually mean we're pivoting when we're in a weak position? I'd be curious. Yeah. How do you see Russia and China exploiting the fissures right now, which they've done for years? This isn't something that just happened 2 weeks ago. They've been doing this for quite some time and have had some success. So what do you think this means in the greater power competition context?
Well, let's just first say that, and just acknowledge again, this is to stop pretending, right? Stop pretending that we needed to withdraw completely from Afghanistan to pivot to China. I mean, that's ridiculous in terms of the number of forces that we had committed in Afghanistan, especially relative to the amount of force that we have committed across the Indo-PACOM theater, right? Just run the numbers. It doesn't make any sense. And of course, geostrategic competition with China and Russia doesn't happen only, in the Indo-Pacific, combatant command area of responsibility, right? It happens actually a lot in South Asia, where you have Pakistan, which has played a principal role in lengthening the war, supporting the Taliban and jihadist terrorist organizations, and has China as its main client state, right? And our defeat in Afghanistan, as you know, is being trumpeted by our adversaries, and trying to exacerbate the doubts that allies and others have about our will, our staying power. And you saw that with the China Daily and these official statements by the Chinese oriented on Taiwan, just as one example. But then let's look at even across the greater Middle East, right? There's this idea that, hey, we just need to just pivot out of the Middle East, right? That was the big Obama administration policy, and that's being carried on now with the Biden administration. It was an element of the Trump administration policy as well, right? The narrative of, we've wasted trillions of dollars, and there's this view of the Middle East as just mainly a mess to be avoided, and a mess to avoid, so we can focus on the real competition, of great power competition. But what do we do in the Middle East? What do we do in Afghanistan over all these years? We kept saying, "Hey, we're leaving." Okay, now we're leaving. Okay, now we're really, really leaving, and actually we never left in the Middle East. And so what we did, though, by saying we're going to leave, is we forfeited all of the benefits in terms of influence of a sustained, relatively small scale but long-term commitment there. We saw that with, President Trump's announcement, of complete withdrawal from Syria that caught everybody, by surprise. In that, guess what? Though, of course, as this audience knows better than anybody, we're still there, right? But what that profession of imminent disengagement does is it creates opportunities for our adversaries, China and Russia. Why the heck do you think UAE is buying everything they're buying from China? Look at the UAE Chinese economic relationship. Why the heck is King Salman, flying to Russia to seal a deal for advanced air defense systems, and And this is why, Russia gets away with, for example, Putin's Potemkin peace plan in Syria. And basically what he's doing is saying to the Gulf states, and even to Israel, hey, just support me in Syria, leave Assad in power, guarantee Russian interests in a post-Civil War Syria. And then he whispers to them, and then what I'll do over time, is I'll reduce Iranian influence. It's all a lie, right? Because obviously Assad is much more reliant on Iran's proxy army than he is on Russia. But what this does is it gives him a window maybe to try to get the Gulf states to write checks, right, to help him reconstruct the country that he helped to destroy. It allows him to maintain a good relationship with Israel, even though Iran is forming a proxy army on its border and trying to create a Levantine land bridge. Because he also lets Iran, bomb whatever Iranian targets they want to in Syria. So this hedging, right? This hedging behavior cuts against our interests in the arena of great power competition. And then look at the map, right? Look at the map. Look at Iran's relationship, the new strategic partnership with China, and look at Houthi rebels in control of the north side of the Bab el-Mandeb, and then look at the Chinese base in Djibouti. Should we care about that? I think maybe we should, and maybe great power competition does have, implications in the Middle East. So I think that we have just, we are just intellectually bankrupt. I mean, this is not, it doesn't take, a PhD or a GED, you know what I mean, to figure this out, man. I just think we get to these bumper stickers, end the endless war, shift to great power competition. Now it's also, AI is going to solve everything. Just like emerging technologies were going to create the revolution in military affairs in the 1990s, and then really, 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 the next war will be fundamentally different from all those that have gone before it. And then we neglect continuities in the nature of war. We turn our eyes away from even the most stinging, and poignant and important lessons from recent wars, and condemn ourselves, right, to repeating many of these same mistakes.
Well, tyranny of time requires I be a bit of a tyrant, but I want to ask one more question, and specifically a glimpse into the future, hopefully a glimmer of some hope there. I'd be curious what you think we can do to redeem ourselves in the eyes of our partners, in the eyes of our allies, and since it is the 20th anniversary, most importantly, in the eyes of the American families who paid the ultimate price for their sacrifice in Afghanistan. Is there a way we can pull our way out, lead, and move forward?
Well, first of all, to all of you, and to all of our sort of brothers and sisters in arms who we served with over the years, and especially those who made the ultimate sacrifice, and the families who suffered that loss and still carry that burden with them. I think what we have to acknowledge is that we were engaged in the noblest of endeavors in Afghanistan. We went there to avenge the deaths of nearly 3,000 innocents and bring justice to some of the most heinous people on earth. In so doing, we helped Afghans gain control of their lives again. We lifted the pall of fear and brutality off of their shoulders, and we allowed them to realize the tremendous gains, sadly, we seem to only now be acknowledging now that they're losing those gains and losing those rights. So sadly, I mean, in witnessing this devastating loss, I think that our servicemen and women should have pride in what they did accomplish. We should take a moment, I think, to lament, our self-defeat there, but recognize, hey, this war's not over. And I am confident, I'm supremely confident that we will win, right? These enemies of all humanity, they can't win. I mean, this ideology can't triumph in any part of the world. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go back. So let's get ready to go back. We had to go back in Iraq. We're going to have to go back in some fashion in Afghanistan. And if I were a planner these days, I would be developing options for a major humanitarian intervention that involved maybe the retaking of airfields and the extension of safe zones and the mandating of the Taliban for safe corridors for passage. If I had it my way, which of course, this was not going to happen, I would declare a safe zone over the Panjshir Valley now. and be airdropping supplies and weapons into Amrullah Saleh there right now. But then to do that, we would have to acknowledge that the Taliban, is not a partner, right? That these are enemies, and there's a good reason why they're enemies. I think we'll slowly come to that realization. I think, Frank, what we're going to be confronted with in the coming days and months and years, possibly, is our images of horrible human suffering based on the brutality of the Taliban. And unlike the last time the Taliban were in power from '96 to 2001, when there wasn't even one cell phone there, we're not going to be able to get out from under. Our political leaders aren't going to be able to get out from under these images. So, I would just say, get ready. America needs you now more than ever. And I think it's time to redouble our determination to prepare for, and then when we're committed, to completely overmatch these enemies of all humanity. And when we get a chance to do so again, it will be, I think all of us would regard it, if we were able to join you, the greatest privilege to do it.
General McMaster, always thoughtful, always insightful, always holding no punches. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you for your sobering, but it may not be what everyone wants to hear, but I think it's something everyone needs to hear. And
hey,
General McMaster, thank you.
Frank, could I just say one last thing here, right?
Of course.
We're all angry about this. I think what's really important for us to do is maintain our professional military ethic, and in particular to recognize that, hey, nobody elects generals, colonels, sergeants major to make policy, right? And so what we have to do now is refocus on giving our best advice, and then recognizing, what we control, right? I think the Stoic philosophers are helpful now these days when we face these kind of trials, that to understand our role, right, and to understand who we are essentially as professional military, and what our role is, what our duty is. And I know you'll fulfill those duties and responsibilities and do so in a professional manner. And I wish I could have been at this conference with you to see some old friends and to communicate in person how much I respect you and how grateful I am for your service. So thanks, Frank, for the opportunity to be with you.
General, thank you for your leadership. Thank you so much. Ron, back over to you.